Hello. I'm recording this now because we weren't able to record it on Wednesday. So this is week 5 of MGT 6145, Foundations of Project Management. This week focuses on Planning 3, Resources, Quality, and Risk. This session completes planning by focusing on resources, quality, and risk as drivers of delivery readiness. This week continues and completes our focus on project planning by shifting away from how work is structured to how it's supported and controlled. We'll begin by framing planning in terms of delivery readiness, then move into 3 key areas: resources, quality, and risk. And from there, we'll bring those elements together and look at how integrated planning strengthens execution readiness and improves overall project delivery. Planning for delivery readiness. Project planning is complete only when the project is ready to execute with coordinated resources, quality expectations, and risk awareness. This week marks the transition into the final phase of planning. Up to this point, the focus has been on defining scope and structuring the work through schedule, cost, and procurement decisions. Those elements define what the project will do and how it's organized. However, planning is not complete until the project is ready to execute. That readiness depends on whether the project has the necessary resources, whether quality expectations are clearly defined, and whether risks have been identified and addressed. Resources define whether the project has the capability to perform the work. Even a well-structured schedule will fail if the right people, skills, or tools are not available when needed. Quality planning defines what good looks like. It establishes the standards, acceptance criteria, and expectations that determine whether the deliverables meet stakeholder needs. Without this clarity, teams may complete work that does not fully satisfy the project objectives. Risk planning addresses uncertainty. All projects operate with some level of unknowns, and identifying risk early allows the team to prepare responses rather than react to problems after they occur. When these areas are not addressed, execution becomes unstable. Delays, rework, and performance issues are more likely. When they're addressed effectively, the project is positioned for coordinated and reliable delivery. Planning is not just about defining the work, it's about preparing the project to execute that work successfully. Defining planning for project delivery. Effective project planning is a coordinated system of decisions that defines how value will be delivered, not just a collection of documents. This slide reframes how we should think about project planning. In many cases, planning is viewed as a documentation exercise, producing plans, templates, and artifacts that describe the project. While those outputs are important, they are not the primary purpose of planning. Effective planning is a coordinated system of decisions that defines how the project will actually deliver value. It answers practical questions such as how the work will be structured, how it will be sequenced, and how it will be resources, how quality will be ensured, and how uncertainty will be managed. Planning also integrates multiple domains. Scope, schedule, cost, resources, quality, and risk are not independent activities. Decisions in one area affect the others. For example, resource constraints may affect schedule, and risk responses may affect both cost and delivery timing. Another key function of planning is alignment. Planning ensures that the delivery approach, whether predictive, adaptive, or hybrid, is consistent with the structure of the work and the expectations of stakeholders. This alignment improves coordination across the project. Strong planning also supports estimation and control. When the project is well defined and structured, it becomes easier to estimate time and cost, monitor progress, and make adjustments when needed. Ultimately, the goal of planning is to reduce ambiguity. It provides clarity about how the work will be performed, who will perform it, and what success looks like. When planning is done well, it establishes more consistent and predictable project delivery. Planning project resources. Resource planning aligns people, skills, and tools with the work to enable execution. Here we begin the first of the key planning domains that complete execution readiness: resource planning. Once the work is defined and structured, the next question is whether the project actually has the capability to perform that work. Resource planning focuses on identifying the people, the skills, the tools, and support needed to execute the project successfully. This includes not only how many resources are needed, but also what type of expertise is required and when those resources must be available. A critical aspect of resource planning is alignment with the schedule. Even if the right resources exist, they must be available at the right time. Misalignment between resource availability and scheduled work is a common cause of delays and efficiency. Resource planning also defines roles and responsibilities. This helps ensure accountability and clarity across the project team. When roles are not clearly defined, coordination becomes more difficult and execution can become fragmented. Another important outcome is identifying constraints. Resource limitations, such as limited availability, competing priorities, or skill gaps can affect schedule, costs, and overall feasibility. Recognizing these constraints early allows the project team to adjust plans before execution begins. Resource planning is not just about assigning people, it's about ensuring the project has the capability and coordination needed to execute effectively. Resource planning and execution feasibility. Execution feasibility depends on realistic resource availability, capacity, and constraints. Here, we build directly on the resource planning by focusing on feasibility. It's one thing to identify the resources needed for a project. It's another to determine whether those resources are actually available in a way that supports execution. Execution feasibility depends on realistic resource availability and capacity. Even well-developed schedules can fail if they assume resources are fully available when in reality, those individuals are supporting multiple projects or responsibilities. One of the most common issues in project execution is overallocation. When resources are assigned more work than they can realistically handle, delays and inefficiencies begin to appear. Tasks take longer, coordination breaks down, and performance suffers. Skill alignment is also critical. Having available resources is not enough if those resources don't have the required expertise. Skill gaps can lead to lower quality outcomes, increased rework, and slower progress. Another factor is competing priorities. In many organizations, team members are shared across projects. This creates constraints that must be recognized during planning. Ignoring these constraints leads to unrealistic schedules and delivery expectations. The key takeaway is that strong planning must reflect reality. Feasible plans are based on actual capacity and constraints, not ideal assumptions. This is what helps ensure that execution can proceed as expected. Planning for quality. Quality planning defines standards and criteria to ensure deliverables meet expectations. This slide shifts the focus from capacity to performance, specifically how we define and manage quality during project delivery. Quality planning is about defining what good looks like before execution begins. This establishes the standards, criteria, and expectations that will be used to evaluate whether deliverables meet stakeholder needs. Without this clarity, teams may complete work that is technically finished but not acceptable. A key idea in modern project management is that quality should be built into the work, not inspected after the fact. Relying on inspection alone often leads to rework, delays, and increased costs. Effective quality planning emphasizes prevention, designing processes, and standards that reduce the likelihood of defects in the first place. Quality planning also ensures alignment with stakeholder expectations. Deliverables must not only meet internal standards, but must also satisfy the needs of those who will use or approve the results. When quality planning is weak, the effects are often significant. Defects increase, rework becomes necessary, schedules slip, and costs rise. When it's done well, quality planning improves efficiency, reduces waste, and supports consistent delivery performance. The key takeaway is that quality is not something that we check at the end, it's something that we define and design into the project from the beginning. Quality planning and rework prevention. Preventing defects through planning is more effective than correcting them after execution. Now we build directly on the previous discussion of quality by focusing on one of the most important practical implications, rework. One of the key principles in project management is that preventing defects is far more effective than correcting them later. When quality is built into the planning, the team is less likely to produce errors that require correction during execution. Rework is one of the most common sources of project inefficiency. When defects are discovered late, they often require revisiting completed work. When defects are discovered late, They often require revisiting completed work, reallocating resources, and adjusting schedules. This creates ripple effects across the entire project. Another important point is that the cost of fixing defects increases the later they are discovered. Issues identified early in planning or design are usually easier and less expensive to address. Once work has been completed or integrated into other components, corrections become more complex and costly. Built-in quality supports smoother execution. When expectations, standards, and processes are clearly defined up front, the project team can work more efficiently with fewer interruptions. Quality planning is not just about meeting standards, it's about protecting the project from inefficiency, disruption, and unnecessary cost. Preventing problems early is one of the most effective ways to improve overall project performance. Planning for risk. Risk planning prepares the project to respond to uncertainty before it becomes a disruption. This slide introduces the final major planning domain for this week, risk. By this point, the project has begun defining how work will be structured, resourced, and controlled. The next question is how the project will deal with uncertainty. Risk planning is the process of preparing for uncertainty before it becomes disruption. In project management, risk refers to uncertain events or conditions that may affect project objectives. Those effects may be negative, such as delays or cost increases, but the broader point is that uncertainty matters because it can alter outcomes. One of the key benefits of risk planning is early identification. The earlier risks are recognized, the more options the project team has for responding effectively. Waiting until risks become active problems usually means the team has fewer choices and less time to respond. Risk can affect every part of the project. It may influence scope, schedule, cost, quality, or resource availability. That is why risk planning should not be treated as a separate activity disconnected from the rest of planning. It is closely tied to all other project decisions. Another benefit of risk planning is that it reduces reactive decision making. Projects that fail to consider uncertainty often spend execution responding to surprises under pressure. By contrast, projects that plan for risk are better positioned to respond in a disciplined and controlled way. Risk planning doesn't eliminate uncertainty, it improves the project's readiness, resilience, and ability to manage uncertainty effectively. Qualitative and quantitative risk thinking. Risk analysis prioritizes uncertainty by assessing the likelihood, impact, and overall exposure. Here, we build on risk identification by focusing on how we evaluate and prioritize risk once they've been identified. Not all risks are equally important, and effective project management requires focusing attention where it matters most. Qualitative risk analysis is typically the first step. It evaluates risks based on their likelihood of occurring and their potential impact on the project. This helps the team quickly identify which risks are most significant and require attention. Quantitative risk analysis goes a step further by estimating the magnitude of risk in measurable terms. This may include potential cost impact, schedule delays, or probability distributions. While not all projects require detailed quantitative analysis, it can be valuable for high impact or complex risk. A key idea is prioritization. The goal of risk analysis is not to analyze every risk in depth, but to identify which risks deserve the most attention. Some risks may be minor and can be monitored with minimal effort, while others require detailed planning and active management. Risk analysis also supports decision making. By understanding the relative importance and potential impact of risk, project managers can make more informed choices about where to allocate time, resources, and attention. Risk analysis helps the project team move from a long list of uncertainties to a focused understanding of what matters most for successful delivery. Risk response planning. Risk response planning defines how the project will address significant risks before they affect delivery. Now we move from risk analysis to action. Once the project team has identified and prioritized risk, the next step is deciding how those risks will be addressed. That's the purpose of risk response planning. In practice, not every risk is handled in the same way. Some risks may be avoided by changing the plan or removing the source of uncertainty. Others may be mitigated by reducing either the likelihood of occurrence or the size of the impact. In some cases, risk may be transferred, such as through insurance, contracting, or outsourcing arrangements. In other situations, the team may choose to accept the risk, especially if exposure is limited or the response would be impractical. The response choice depends on several factors. The project team needs to consider the level of exposure, the project context, the cost of the response, and whether the response is realistic to implement. A theoretically strong response is not useful if it cannot be executed effectively. Contingency planning is also important. For risks that are significant and reasonably likely, the team may define specific fallback actions, reserves, or trigger points. This improves readiness and makes execution more controlled if the event occurs. Strong risk responses protect delivery performance. They reduce the chance that risk will create major cost overruns, schedule disruptions, quality issues, or resource strain. Risk response planning is about preparing decisions in advance rather than improvising under pressure. The project team enters execution with a clearer strategy for managing significant uncertainty. Integrating resources, quality, and risk. Resources, quality, and risk must be planned together to support reliable project delivery. This slide brings together the three major planning areas we have covered in this part of the lecture: resources, quality, and risk. While we've discussed them separately for clarity, in practice they are closely connected and should be planned as part of one system. Resource limits can increase both risk and quality problems. If the project lacks the right people, skills, or time, the team may rush work, miss important checks, or struggle to maintain consistency. That can reduce quality and create additional uncertainty during execution. Quality failures also affect other areas. When defects occur, rework becomes necessary. Rework consumes additional resources, increases cost pressure, and often introduces new risks to schedule and performance. In that sense, poor quality is not an isolated issue. It creates ripple effects across the project. Risk responses can also affect both resources and quality. A mitigation strategy may require staffing, added testing, and more review points or contingency reserves. That means the way the project plans for uncertainty directly affects how work is resourced and controlled. The main lesson is planning decisions in one domain influence the others. Treating resources, quality, and risk as separate plans can create gaps or conflicting assumptions. Integrated planning helps the team see these interactions early and make better coordinated decisions. The key takeaway is that reliable project delivery depends on planning these areas together. Integration improves readiness, coordination, and control before execution begins. Planning as a system. Effective planning works as an integrated system that prepares the project for execution. Here we bring together the broader planning story from both Week 4 and Week 5. Up to this point, we have examined planning in parts so that each domain could be understood clearly. But in practice, effective planning does not happen as a series of isolated documents or disconnected activities. It works as an integrated system. Earlier planning topics such as scope, schedule, costs, and procurement help define the structure of delivery. They establish what the project will deliver, how the work will unfold, what it is expected to cost, and how external support will be obtained when needed. These are foundational planning decisions. This week's topics, resources, quality, and risk, add another layer. They strengthen execution readiness by addressing whether the project has the capability, standards, and resilience needed to perform the work successfully. The main point is that these planning areas interact continuously. A resource issue may affect schedule and cost, a quality problem may create rework and new risk, a procurement delay can affect both timing and resource availability, a risk response may require more budget, more time, or tighter controls. These are not separate concerns. They are part of one delivery system. When planning is treated in isolation, the result is often gaps, conflicting assumptions, and weak coordination. One plan may appear sound on its own, but still fail to fit with the rest of the project. Integrated planning improves control, alignment, and performance because it helps the team see connections early and make better decisions before execution begins. The key takeaway here is that planning adds the most value when it's treated as a system that prepares the project to execute in a coordinated and realistic way. Planning reframed, PMBOK 7 to PMBOK 8. PMBOK 8 treats planning as a focus area integrated across performance domain. One useful thing is to pause and notice here is that PMI's language about planning has changed a little between PMBOK 7 and PMBOK 8. And I think that change actually helps us understand modern project management better. In PMBOK 7, planning is presented as one of the project performance domains. So in PMBOK 7, planning is still very visible as one major part of the overall project management system. It sits alongside other domains like stakeholders, team, delivery, project work, measurement, and uncertainty. That framing makes it pretty easy to understand and recognize because planning is right there in its own category. Now, when we move to PMBOK 8, PMI shifts that structure. Planning is no longer presented on its own structured, standalone performance domain. Instead, planning becomes a focus area. And that's an important distinction because it changes how we think about what planning actually is. What PMI is really saying in PMBOK 8 is that planning is not something separate from the rest of the project management. It's not just a phase, and it's not a document set, and it's not something that only happens once at the beginning. Instead, planning is embedded across the work. It shows up in scope decisions, schedule decisions, finance decisions, stakeholder decisions, resource decisions, and risk decisions. In other words, planning is happening throughout the system. I think this is actually a very useful shift. It reflects the reality that projects do not move in a perfectly neat sequence, where we plan once, then execute, then control. In real projects, planning continues. We keep adjusting, refining, coordinating, and responding as we learn more. So PMBOK 8 pushes us to see that planning is continuous, integrated decision-making, rather than a separate box in the framework. That also connects really well to what we've been doing in this course. In week 4, we focused on schedule, cost, and procurement. And in week 5, we focus on resources, quality, and risk. It still makes sense to organize those as planning topics because we need a structured way to learn them. But from a PMBOK 8 perspective, what we're really seeing is that planning is distributed across all of those decisions. So this is a nice way to explain the difference. In PMBOK 7, planning is easier to point to because it's named as a performance domain. In PMBOK 8, planning is still there, but it's reframed. It becomes a focus area that operates across the performance domains and supports integrated delivery. The other thing that stays consistent across both editions is tailoring. PMI is not moving away from planning. PMI is moving away from the idea that planning should be rigid, isolated, or a one-size-fits-all. Both editions still emphasize that the project manager needs to adjust the approach based on context, uncertainty, delivery model, and stakeholder needs. And that matters even more when we think about predictive, adaptive, and hybrid work. In a predictive project, planning may feel more front-loaded. In an adaptive project, planning may be lighter early on, but continue in shorter cycles. In a hybrid project, some parts may be stable while other parts evolve. PMBOK 8's focus area language fits that reality a little better because it treats planning as something that keeps happening across the life of the project. The big takeaway here is this. Planning has not become less important. If anything, it has become more integrated. It is no longer best understood as just a planning phase or a planning document set. It is best understood as an ongoing capability that helps the project make coordinated decisions and deliver value more effectively. Planning enables reliable project delivery. Integrated planning enables reliable, coordinated, and consistent project delivery. It's important to bring everything back to the main idea of the course, project delivery. Everything we've covered in this part of planning is really about one question. Can this project actually deliver successfully? Resources ensure that the project has the capability to perform the work. Without the right people, skills, and tools, even a well-structured plan will struggle during execution. Quality planning defines what success looks like. It sets expectations for what the deliverables need to achieve and helps ensure that the project produces outcomes that meet stakeholder needs. Risk planning prepares the project for uncertainty. Since all projects involve some level of unpredictability, identifying risk and planning responses helps reduce disruption and improve stability during execution. What ties all this together is integration. These areas, resources, quality, and risk, do not operate independently. Decisions in one area affect others, and effective planning brings them together into a coordinated system. When planning is done well, execution tends to be more stable, more predictable, and more efficient. When planning is weak or disconnected, we tend to see delays, rework, and inconsistency in delivery. So the key takeaway is that planning is not just preparation, it's what enables reliable project delivery. Managerial takeaways. Effective planning enables reliable, coordinated, value-driven project delivery. As we wrap up this week, let's step back and focus on what really matters from a managerial perspective. Planning is not just about producing documents or completing templates. It's about preparing the project to execute successfully. Everything we've discussed, resources, quality, and risk, contributes to that readiness. One of the most important ideas is that these areas are interdependent. Resource decisions affect quality, quality issues affect risk, and risk responses affect both cost and schedule. If these areas are planned in isolation, gaps and inconsistencies are likely to appear during execution. Integration is what brings planning together. When planning decisions are coordinated across domains, the project becomes easier to manage, work is better aligned, expectations are clearer, and the team is more prepared to respond to challenges. Another key takeaway is realism. Strong planning reflects actual constraints, capacity, and uncertainty. It avoids overly optimistic assumptions that can lead to delays and rework later on. Ultimately, effective planning supports reliable delivery. It creates the structure, clarity, and coordination needed for the project to perform consistently. Planning is not just preparation, it's what enables successful delivery. And that is the end of the video and the presentation. Your viewing of this video and your presence in class shows a meaningful commitment to your education, your professional growth, and your future in project management, and is valued greatly.